Everybody, welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Seth Robertson. He is a lecturer in philosophy and associate director of undergraduate studies at Harvard University. His research interests include moral psychology, the history of ethics, early Chinese ethics, social epistemology, virtue ethics, and metaethics. And today we're talking about normative theorizing and if it should be informed by non-normative information, perspectival naturalism, Confucian ethics, and some other related topics. So, Dr. Robertson, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to everyone.
Thank you so much, Ricardo, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm excited to chat about some of these topics.
So I would like to start by asking you about normative theorizing, but perhaps it's better for us to start with some definitions or with a little
Good,
bit
yeah.
of background here. So first of all, what is normative theorizing? What do you mean by that? And on the other hand, what is non-normative information?
Yeah, great. So this is something that has been interesting to me for a very long time. Even in my very first undergraduate ethics class, I remember asking questions about this. And so here's a really general question that doesn't actually, fully answer what you asked about, but is a good starting point. So yeah, two questions. So one is, to do ethics well as a philosopher, as an ethicist, do you need to learn about things? Do you need to study things other than ethics, other than ethical theory? So that's one question. A slightly different, maybe substantially different question is, to do ethics well, personally, to be a good person, to make good moral decisions, what do you need to know beyond ethical theory? I mean, some philosophers and non-philosophers might ask, do you need to know that much about ethical theory? There's interesting research on that, including some that you've talked to some folks doing on your show.
Mm-hmm.
But sort of to get at this question, what do we mean by normative and non-normative? These are terms that we use in philosophy all the time and don't always explain exactly what we mean to students when we say them. I remember a friend of mine in graduate school in my master's program, after studying philosophy at the graduate level for 2 years, said, I still don't know what normative means. But so what I mean by it, and this, I don't think I mean anything all that special or different by it, but there are questions about what should we do? What should we believe? What should we feel? What should we think? Those are normative questions. Mm-hmm. So questions that have to do with what shoulds, oughts, goods, bads, right or wrong. Typically in philosophy, when we talk about normativity, we're usually thinking about morality, ethics. But so questions about what should we do, or maybe what kind of person should we try to become, or what kind of character traits should we try to develop, what kind of motivations should we have for our actions, what kind of reasons should we have in our ethical decision making. But of course, there are lots of shoulds beyond moral, right? So there's what we say, epistemic should. So what should I believe? What am I justified in believing something? There are sort of prudential shoulds. So given what I want, given my own life's happiness or flourishing, what should I pursue? Should I take this job or that job, right? What should I major in? Should I be friends with this person? Would they be a good friend or not? So all of these questions about shoulds, should do, should decide to do, should believe, should think. These are normative questions. Right. And in 20th century thought, there was often a kind of strong divide between normative and non-normative questions. And we have different ways of describing this. Sometimes we see prescriptive versus descriptive, right? And so as you know very well, in the 20th century, was sort of a widespread belief in academia, right, that certain fields of study are doing mostly non-normative work. They're trying to understand how the world works, right? So the sciences are trying to understand how the world works. And normativity, ethics, that sort of stuff, that wishy-washy stuff, maybe they can talk about that in philosophy departments, but no, that's not what we're doing. We're trying to figure out how the world really works. And so you get like people say there's like this really strong distinction between like facts and opinions or facts and values. And things like that. Now, more recently, people have pointed out that, this is actually really messy sort of thing. Like you can't do science without values like, good evidence, rigor, appreciation for truth, appreciation for honesty, like intellectual honesty, honestly reporting your data, things like that. So it turns out that probably all of our lives, including like our research lives in academia, regardless of our field, are infused with normativity in various ways. But so that was like a very long-winded explanation that still didn't get to the original question, right? Which was, why am I so interested in non-normative information for normative decision-making? So even though I just sort of said like, it's really, really messy, everything's normative in various ways, I think going back to the original questions that I asked. So to do ethics well, to do moral philosophy well, what do you need to know outside of ethical theory to make your own moral decisions, your own ethical decisions, to decide what kind of ethical person you want to be? What do you need to know beyond ethical theory? And different philosophers, different people have thought about this. There's a huge spectrum of answers, right? Some people are very happy to do like highly abstract philosophy, right? Sitting in their armchair, coming up with really, really impressive, complex, robust theories. Some people are happy to really, really get into the weeds of debates about these theories very rigorously and spend a lot of their time doing ethics, thinking about that, very, very, very abstract theoretical kind of work. And I think that's really, really important. I think that's a very valid and very important way of doing moral philosophy. But it's a spectrum. Many other philosophers have been interested in what do we need to know about human psychology, human sociology, human behavior, and how does that influence our ethical theorizing? So, like, to give an example, in Kant's groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, at the very beginning, he makes this distinction. So Kant, right, the moral, like 1700s, one of the great moral philosophers, says, there's metaphysics of morality, and that's these, big philosophical questions about how morality works, and there's the anthropology of morality. And by that, he means, like, today we would probably say moral psychology, moral anthropology. One way of thinking about this distinction is the philosophy comes first, then you develop your ethical theory, you do like really, really good critical thinking, and then you figure out how to apply that in the real world. So on that way of thinking about things, the philosophy and the real world application are kind of separate, and the philosophy is first. Other people throughout history and today have thought that they're much more intertwined, right? And maybe it's not as clear which one should have priority. So for various reasons. Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics famously said, we're not trying to just merely understand like what virtue is, the definition of virtue, but to become virtuous. And so the last thing that I'll say about this, like to sort of give an example, right? There are sort of two big things where to get to your original question, non-normative information matters. So one is, I think, maybe not controversial at all. To make good decisions in general, you need good information, right? So like when you're deciding which politician to support, which policies do they support, you need not regular good information about like, will this policy actually be effective? Will trickle down economics work? Right. So regardless of what you think about like the end goal, the morality of the end goal, will like that policy work? And then there's sort of messy questions that are kind of normative, non-normative, like, okay, do I trust this person? Right. So they say they're going to do these policies. Are they actually going to do it or not? Right. So there's this, and I think that the vast majority of philosophers throughout history would be very happy to grant this. Then there's and this is where I think it's really interesting. Then there are sort of deeper questions about how much should that kind of thing go feed back into our ethical theorizing?
Right.
How much should we be concerned about how human moral psychology works?
Mhm.
And I think the answer, and I'm not the only person, I'm, at one end of the spectrum of philosophers, I think it matters quite a bit.
Mhm. Okay, so I have one or two more questions about that, but let me just say, and perhaps you can comment on it, that of course on the show I've already talked many times with
Yeah.
moral
Yeah.
psychologists,
Yes.
with people who work on morality from an anthropological
Mhm.
perspective, from the
Yeah.
perspective of game theory, and I
Yeah.
guess we could put all of this in the descriptive camp of
Yeah.
things, in the non-normative
Mhm.
informational camp of things.
Yeah. Yep.
And I guess that when it comes to how ethicists or moral philosophers
Yeah.
then deal with this information,
Mhm.
I mean, one of the debates that interests me the most, for example, is the debate in metaethics between the
Yeah.
moral realists and the
Yeah.
moral anti-realists. And
Yeah.
they pick sometimes on the same information, but use it in different
Yeah.
ways. So, for
Right.
example, the moral realists,
Yeah.
they already have some sort of framework in mind, and they say,
Mhm.
oh, this is what we should strive for, this is what's
Mhm.
good to attain, and so on. And
Yeah.
so with the constraints that we know of about
Mhm.
our
Yeah.
moral psychology, then
Yeah.
this is the way we should strive toward these goals,
Yeah.
this good,
Yeah.
whatever. And the moral anti or the yeah, the
Mhm.
moral anti-realists, what they
Mhm.
do many times is that they bring to the table information or knowledge from psychology, anthropology,
Yeah.
sociology, and so on to build
Yeah.
the case that
Mhm.
there's really not
Yeah.
anything objective
Yeah.
about morality out there.
Yeah.
There's no
Yeah.
objective moral values. It's
Yeah.
just a matter of different
Mhm.
preferences, different psychological
Yeah.
predispositions, people being
Yeah.
exposed to different cultural environments,
Mhm.
and so on. So that's,
Mhm.
for example, one of the ways that this sort of question that we're addressing here
Yeah.
manifests in both
Mhm.
science and then how it gets
Yeah.
applied to philosophy or moral philosophy
Yeah.
more specifically.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I mean, I think this is fascinating. And I've also personally been there, right? So um I sort of switched in when I was in graduate school from a moral realist to a moral anti-realist,
Mm.
in large part because of these concerns. And so I was
Right.
one of the people who was like, using some of this um research from outside of psychology to argue both ways. I don't know that I'm, more correct now than I was in the past. But yeah,
And so, but I mean, when you talk about non-normative information and it
yeah,
possibly constraining
yeah,
our normative
yeah,
theorizing, what kinds, of course, I think you've already
absolutely.
gave some examples
Yeah.
then, but
Mhm.
what kinds of non-normative
Yeah,
information are you
right.
referring to exactly?
Yeah. So as I mentioned before, I've for a long time been quite interested in, empirical research and moral psychology and related fields.
Right.
And just having a better understanding of how our moral minds work. And that's absolutely no easy feat for multiple reasons. But I have for a long time really thought that that's quite important. But I don't think that's the only thing that's really, really interesting and really, really useful for ethicists. Um, so, for example, I also think that what we might call like sort of philosophical anthropology is really useful. And what I mean by this is things like moral slang. Um, if you start thinking about it, our moral vocabularies are just absolutely full of ethical terms, right? And I think, especially characterological terms like describing robust traits. So somebody, and these are things that have, somebody's a jerk, right? Things that have been
Yeah.
explored by philosophers, like including philosophers that you've interviewed, right? Um, there's a really good, and that's like Eric Schwitzkable's works. So there's a really good little paper by the philosopher Bonnie Mann on being a creep. Like, what does it mean to be a creep? Um, you know, there's so much really interesting work about like, yeah, moral slang, and yeah, you start to like how many words we have, like a rat, a snitch, a mensch, an OG, right? We have so many words describing people and traits. And so I think that's really interesting. A recent paper that I had on this was like, what's wrong with unhelpful comments? Right. So I got really interested in when people describe, like, well, that was a really unhelpful thing to say, or that was an unhelpful comment. What are they really saying?
Yeah.
So for me, like, people are constantly making moral claims, epistemic claims, normative claims in general. They're using normative vocabulary, and often in really, really interesting ways.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it's worth investigating that. And how does that work? I think there's often lots of really interesting lessons there. And the last thing that I wanted to mention specifically, and this is something that's really influenced my work, is just the fact that we're socially situated creatures. We live in societies, and those societies have entrenched power structures, right? So
Mhm.
various people and groups have more power than others, and they build that into our systems and societies, right? And so I think, and this is, again, it's not just me. There's a spectrum of philosophers who are concerned about this. In philosophy, we often call this like non-ideal approaches, right?
Yeah.
So when we do our theorizing in ethics or epistemology, we're really, really concerned and think we need to take account of the fact that different groups and people have more power than others and use that power in various ways. And we need to have our theories like really, really being paying attention to that.
So, keeping in mind one of the points you made earlier, that, and this is something that I've already talked with other people on the show, that values also play a role in science and in the production
Yeah,
of
yeah,
scientific knowledge. So, keeping that caveat in mind,
yeah,
just to close this section of the
yeah,
interview, so should you then, do you think then that we should or should non-normative information
yeah,
constrain our normative theorizing?
yeah, yeah. I think absolutely it should in a lot of different ways, right? So,
Mm.
and I mean, again, with the caveat that the distinction is incredibly messy, and
Right.
maybe it's a spectrum at best,
Yeah.
but and some of this sort of might make more sense once we see applications of like what would this actually look like in practice. um, but yeah, so if you sort of take it as a like a descriptive claim that in fact the way that human societies work is that they're quite often hierarchical, they're often have entrenched hierarchies of power. If you say that that's like just grant that's more on the non-normative side, that's more on the descriptive side, I think that theories that don't pay serious attention to that, maybe even in the very first steps of theorizing, um, it's just a potentially dangerous move. You might be missing out on incredibly important things,
Mhm.
and your theories might not be well placed to actually address these problems when we get there. And so, this is, again, for philosophers, this is the non ideal stuff, right?
Mhm. And of course, I guess that you would agree if I say that here, when it comes to the kinds of non-normative information and how we
Mm-hmm.
deal with it, and then normatively
Mm-hmm.
theorize about
Yeah.
ethics and moral philosophy, we
Yeah.
have to keep in mind that, of course, it's not as simple as we having
Yeah.
a sort of human nature that is fixed, because I mean, as we
Yes.
learned through human
Yeah.
behavioral ecology and
Right.
anthropology and some other
Mm-hmm.
disciplines. I mean, of
Yeah.
course, we have certain evolved predispositions, but they are much more malleable than
Right.
just like evolutionary theory just by
Yes.
itself would tell you.
Hmm. Absolutely. And to me, this is an incredibly important point. Just that this, like, even from like a purely evolutionary standpoint, even that is incredibly messy,
Mhm.
right? So yeah, it's sort of like very simplistic claims about human nature. I mean, one of my favorite, like least favorite, you get like an intro to philosophy class, right? Students, human beings are inherently selfish, right? That's like one of the more like, well, what does it mean to be inherently, like, from an evolutionary perspective? Well, we have all sorts of things that maybe are more hardwired, but that's like there's tons of different stuff going on in our brains, and that's not even, well, like, once we add in culture to the mix, and like how those things interact.
Yeah.
So I think it's incredibly important that this is all incredibly messy, because that makes it more difficult to have a nice, simple theory that can explain it all.
Yeah, and I mean, that came to my mind also because since you mentioned, for example, people thinking that we are innately predisposed toward
Yeah.
building hierarchical societies. I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, that might be true to some extent,
Mhm.
but then
Yeah.
if you assume that there's no malleability to that, then you
Exactly.
will
Yeah.
inevitably build
Yeah.
a hierarchical society
Right.
when perhaps in certain contexts
Yeah.
that could not apply, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it doesn't imply that, we need to do things in a certain way,
Sure.
or that, yeah, because, yeah. So I think it's always a complex question and answer, and it needs a lot of investigation, figuring out, okay, so what actually are we predisposed to do? That's incredibly difficult to figure out. And then there's sort of like, given that, what can we do about it? That's also incredibly difficult to figure out. And people have a tendency to oversimplify these things.
Mhm. And so I guess that related to what we've been talking about, could you tell us a little bit about this sort of novel version of metaethical
Yeah.
Humean
Yeah.
constructivism
Yeah.
that you called perspectival naturalism? What
Yeah.
is that really
Yeah.
about?
Good. Yeah. So I should say, um, this was work in my dissertation.
Mhm.
So it's stuff that's been in the back of my mind for the
Yeah.
past 4 or 5 years. And what I was really trying to do there is sort of figure out, what do I really believe about all of this? What's my own approach?
Yeah.
Because I was really torn, right? So you've had so many great philosophers and people specialize in metaethics who can talk about this much more fluently and correctly than I can. But what I want to say, it's really interesting to me that we're so like metaethically muddled. On the one hand, like students come into my ethics classes, they have such strong political opinions, they have strong ethical opinions, but at the same time they'll like really strongly assert things like, well, morality is relative, or this is all subjective. And it's like, well, how do you square away this really strong assertion about like morality, it's relative, it's subjective, but at the same time having really, really, really strong moral or political opinions? um, and those are the questions at the heart of metaethics, right?
Mhm.
And so like longtime listeners of your show like will have heard this distinction, like moral realism and anti-realism.
Mhm.
And the canned history of that is maybe early on in the 20th century. By realism, are there moral facts, are there moral truths?
Mhm.
But then as the discussion went on and on and on, sort of like as you've already sort of mentioned, the discussion shifted to thinking about objectivity, right? Are there
Mhm.
objective moral truths or objective moral facts?
Yeah.
And what do we mean by objective? That's incredibly difficult to say.
Yeah.
But the general sort of idea that developed is like sort of compare certain other fields of study, like certain sciences or history, where the facts that they're like the fact of the matter, it's out there. It doesn't depend on anything about our minds. Maybe the way that we explain it depends on our minds, but the thing that is being studying is like it's out there.
Mhm.
That's what we mean roughly, very incredibly roughly, by objective. And anti-realist of various stripes will say no, morality, moral claims depend in some way, or they aren't. The old school version was they aren't factual at all, right? They're
Yeah.
just sort of expressing our emotions or something like that.
Mhm.
But the sort of many of the newer versions are saying, yeah, they're not objective. That's that they aren't based entirely on stuff outside of our minds.
Mhm.
So, and this is something, when people start learning about this, they sort of, been told, they've heard so many times, morality is subjective, morality is relative. And, there is like something to that, in the sense that, yeah, if you studied abroad, if you lived in different cultures, that, people's behaviors and opinions and things like that vary quite a bit. But again, at the same time, we have these really strong like political beliefs, moral beliefs about various things. So philosophers have been really, like more recently, the past 30 or 40 years, have been really attracted to moral realism. It makes sense of things like the civil right, like racism is genuinely unjust. Sexism is genuinely unjust. If you believe those sorts of things, how can you make sense of that without being a realist? And so I was like very much in that camp. And then I encountered evolutionary debunking arguments. And for a long, and you know, you've talked about this on your show, right? So I won't like go into tons of detail about this, but for a long time I was like, no, this can't be right. But this general idea really was in the back of my mind that if you start with the assumption that morality, ethics could have been, if it's objective, it could have been anything, right? Like what would be the objective moral truths? Well, they could be anything. How would we figure them out? And the idea of evolutionary debunking arguments, and again, longtime listeners know this, but the very, very general and maybe overly simplistic idea is, well, our intuitions about what we morally should do are shaped by many factors. And like important set of them are evolutionary, the kind of creatures that we are, right? And so my example of this, which is like, you know, kind of strong, but I think is relevant, is if we were highly evolved spiders, our ethical systems would look entirely different. We wouldn't care so much about raising our children and protecting children. We wouldn't care so much about that. And so the very rough intuition underlying evolutionary debunking arguments is that one of the key factors shaping our ethical intuitions is our evolutionary history. They weren't necessarily tracking truth. And I came to think more and more and more, there's something to that. Now, you might say in response, well, that might pose some trouble for some approaches in metaethics, but there's other approaches that are perfectly safe. So like the word here is like intuitionistic approaches, right? So you might say something like, okay, this is kind of like probability. We're naturally not very good at doing probability, right? That's why it took so long to figure out, but we could figure it out, right? We figured out how to do math in general. We do the math, we do the logic. Like once you've got rationality and logical on the table, you can figure things out. And so even if like we were evolutionary not predisposed to figuring out objective moral truth, we could figure it out using rationality and logic or something like that.
Yeah.
I was initially attracted to that view quite a bit, but then, you know, and like a lot of these views, well, maybe some truths are self-evident, right? But then I realized, like, I call it like the unicorn or the hobbit problem, right? So claims like unicorns have horns or hobbits have big feet, right? Like Lord of the Rings, right? So these are like fictional entities. Like, are those claims true? Like, are they self-evident? Well, yeah, sort of like if you understand what the words mean, yeah, unicorns have horns. But that doesn't mean that the properties being described actually exist in the world, right? So I started to worry that moral claims like murder is wrong is the go-to example of like that's self-evident, like it just means murder is wrongful killing. But if you're saying that like murder means objectively wrongful killing, the fact that there's like a self-evident truth, if that is self-evident, I'm not sure that the objective part there is self-evident to anyone other than certain philosophers. But even if you grant that, to me, that doesn't imply that property being described exists in this world, right? So I think that there is a dangerous leap there. And again, like I'm not a metaethics specialist. I was just trying to figure this out for myself. So I started to think like the strongest versions of moral realism where morality is really, really objective. I just couldn't see my way to thinking that those were correct anymore. Now, throughout history, there's been like two big lines of responses to this. One is a really strong anti-realist kind of response. And I think like in ancient India, there's like a school called the Charvakya, and they say this. You see this in some of Plato's like dialogue. So Thrasymachus, you see this in the Gorgias. You see this in the history of Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian War, the Melian dialogue, the dialogue between the Athenians and the Melians, the Athenian side. People say, ethics, it's just an invention. Morality is just an invention of some sort. And so anyone who believes in it, they're just being silly. I think there's a ancient Chinese text called Robert Jur. You also get an argument like that. So anyone who believes in morality, come on, it's all made up, it's all constructed. You're just a fool for believing in it. That's one route that people have gone. Another route that is maybe like technically anti-realist in the sense that it says that morality isn't like fully objective like this, says, okay, yeah, but we care about all this stuff. That's kind of like a basic premise in evolutionary debunking arguments, right? That we do care about it. And so there's the idea is like, given that we care about it, are there better or worse ways of doing it? And that, in the most general terms, is kind of the constructivist picture in metaethics. And now there are, much more theoretically robust and precise and rigorous ways of stating it. But that's the sort of general intuition, that we care about things. Like we would say, like we have evaluative standpoints. And what can we do given that? Now, there are different ways of cashing that out. So and this work here is the Sharon Street's excellent work exploring this. And so there's like a Kantian thought that, all of these standpoints where we care about things should probably be governed by like basic rules of logic, like don't contradict yourself. And Kant thinks that you can get quite a bit of morality out of that basic intuition. And so it isn't quite objective, but it is that like every standpoint should be concerned with these sorts of things. So it's kind of like pretty close to objective without being objective. It's still based in our standpoints and our concerns. The Humean approach, right? So like David Hume, 1700 Scottish philosopher, sort of says that there are so many different practical standpoints that not only people could have, but all sorts of like moral creatures, imagine aliens or something like that, could have had. And so there isn't going to be a single theory that applies to all of them. And so Hume's, like quick examples are like, he thinks we're naturally like sympathetic, empathetic. We care about others' well-being in various ways. So that's a concern. Then he also sorts of thinks that they're, given our various concerns, there might be values that we need to develop, maybe invent our artificial virtues. So he thinks like justice is something like this. That it's like not he thinks, maybe we don't have naturally strong inclinations about justice or dispositions to care about it, but to get society to function, given the things we do care about it, we need to create something like that. The approach that I kind of took on today, I would probably call it something like a Confucian constructivism.
We're going to get into Confucian.
Yeah, we're going to talk about it. So I kind of knew that I was like thinking about this, but it didn't really strike me until my dissertation defense, when one of my teachers, wonderful teacher, Amy Oberding, was like, this is like Xunzi, one of the greatest Confucian philosophers. Like, this is Xunzi reborn. I was like, oh yeah, it actually is. My thought was one of the sort of like anti-realist moves that wants to keep doing mostly what we've been doing, not throw it all away, sort of has thought about ethics as a kind of technology or an invention. And that's a good thing, right? That doesn't mean that we should just throw it all away. So one of the earliest statements of this is a person I just mentioned, Xunzi, who is an ancient Confucian philosopher. He literally says the ancient sages invented ritual and rightness. And so kind of like small ethical things and big ethical things, because the ancient sages invented it. Like that's like the term that he uses. And I already mentioned Hume's artificial virtues, famously, Mackey's Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong, one of the most famous, important, influential works of anti-realism. He says, like, morality is not to be discovered but made. There's in Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras. Protagoras gives this. It was, I guess, quite a famous speech in the ancient world. It's not so quite as famous today in contemporary philosophy, but he sort of says that when the gods created humans, first it was a mess. They couldn't get anything to stay. The humans just fought each other. And so then the gods decided to give them a sense of justice and a sense of shame. And then humans could cooperate and society can like live together in cities. And one that was really influential for me and kind of where that name perspectival naturalism came from was a philosopher, Philip Kitchard's book, The Ethical Project, which came out almost, well, I guess, yeah, 10, a little bit more than 10 years ago now. And he developed this view called pragmatic naturalism. So he was interested in the American pragmatists. So like John Dewey, Kitchard really likes this quote from Dewey that moral conceptions and processes grow naturally out of the very conditions of human life, right? We're just moral creatures. If we don't think too much about what morality means there, but so Kitchard think like, yeah, we're just naturally morally concerned. And so what Kitchard thinks is like the view that he developed there in that book was basically something like this, that we're kind of naturally altruistic. And that's, he spends a lot of time sorting out what do we mean by altruism. If you were like a certain kind of scientist, especially in the 60s, 70s, that would be preposterous. But for like Kitchard, we are naturally like other concerned in various ways, but we have many like he calls altruism failures. So we're concerned with others, but not that well. And this leads to sort of like an internal tension, a felt tension. And so he thinks that ethics, like ethical theorizing in its like earliest forms, is developing out of this. And we develop systems to try to cope with this tension. And none of the systems are perfect. They have their own internal tensions. And so we update them to fix those internal tensions or to alleviate those internal, and we just sort of keep doing that. But the idea here, and for many of these views, is there's a specific function of ethics. And so the sort of way of thinking about it, the metaphor is sort of like ethics as a technology, right? Where a technology is, like a can opener. There's a specific problem that you need to solve, and the technology is designed to solve it. And so do you evaluate whether the instance of the technology is good or bad based on how well it serves that function? So does the can opener open cans well, right? Yeah. I thought there was something really, really fascinating and probably correct about this. But as we alluded towards earlier, morality is so messy, right? Even like from, purely evolutionary perspective, there's so much going on. So many of the moral intuitions that we have, feelings and attitudes, like morally relevant feelings, attitudes, dispositions, emotions, evolved at different times and for different reasons. And then once you add culture into the mix, personal upbringing, even like philosophical theorizing, it's just a complete mess. And so I thought, sort of thinking about, as much as I thought that these views were getting something right, thinking about morality as having kind of a single underlying function or a small set of them wasn't the right way to go. And so I started thinking about ethics. At the time I called it like ethics as design. Today I would say like co-design. And so the idea is like a slightly different metaphor where when you're designing something, there isn't like one consideration that you're trying to maximize. You have multiple considerations that you're trying to weigh. There isn't necessarily one best way of doing it. There's multiple different ways that you can balance these multiple considerations. So then where does this perspectival bit come in? Yeah. This is one of the things that I should say, there's been really, really, really cool work on perspective by philosophers like Elizabeth Camp and Kate Elgin in the past, 10, 15 years. And so by perspective, what's really interesting to me about that, what I mean by that is like perspectives filter information. And we think in terms of perspective. We don't have access to all of the information out there, right? We don't have access to all the information in our mind. When we have a perspective sort of highlights some information, it hides or occludes some information. And it's an essential feature of how we think. We think in terms of perspectives. So I've been interested in this for a long time. I also got interested in thinking about like, what does this mean for ethical theorizing, right? And this might be a segue to some of the other stuff to talk about. But I was really struck by, and I like recently gave a talk, and I started by like, have you ever noticed that what's obvious varies from academic department to department? Right. And so I was, my master's program, I was like doing lots of utilitarian stuff. My intuitions were really utilitarian. My PhD program, I was suddenly surrounded by virtue ethicists, and it was just as intuitive to them that virtue ethics made sense and was approached. Now I'm surrounded by Kantians, and it's, the ways that people talk, like just as it's obvious for some people to talk about morality in terms of principles, it was just as obvious to talk about morality in terms of virtues. And that, really struck me, like, why are people so confident in their intuitions? Well, partly the reason is when you occupy a perspective for a long time, perspectives make things obvious. Right. So I think that has lots of implications. That one of the implications that will make sense at this point in our discussion is, given the complexity of morality that we've been like mentioned several times, my thought was that there couldn't be we shouldn't want a single correct moral theory, because the idea is, if we occupy perspectives, a perspective is like going to highlight some things, that's very useful, but it's also going to hide some things. And there's more information than any psychological perspective that we could actually occupy, or moral information that we would want our moral theories in general to be able to capture, than any single one perspective could. And so the thought was that actually we should be pluralist when it comes to doing moral theory, because no single approach is going to capture everything that we needed to capture.
So by being pluralist in the specific case of ethical theory, you're talking about bringing together, for example, consequentialism, virtue ethics,
right,
deontology.
Yeah, exactly. Things like that, it might be really, really useful to, be a Kantian about certain things, but it should not be the only perspective, because again, it highlights certain things really well, and that's incredibly useful. And this is something that, people who have, well, I'm a utilitarian, or I'm a people who think that is the best theory, they'll often sort of say, well, I can capture all of those intuitions that you say my theory doesn't. And, it's bugged me for a while that people will make this move, but then they never actually care about. So deontologists, Kantians will say, we care about virtue ethics. Like Kant and the metaphysics of morals spent the entire second half of the book talking about virtue, and then they never actually talk about it, right? And the idea is actually, it's fine insofar as we take multiple approaches, as long as we don't, think that one approach has to be the single correct approach. Because again, I think that given the the genuine descriptive fact, the non-normative fact that we think in terms of perspectives, and that we're, not omniscient or epistemically omnipotent, we can't have a single correct ethical theory, an ethical theory that'll capture everything we need to capture. So we need multiple ones.
Would one of the ways that this more pluralistic perspective would work I mean, I'm asking you this because actually recently, once it came to my mind, this idea. I mean,
Mm.
would it be, for example, that for individual ethical problems, you
Yeah,
would apply a specific perspective without having to apply the same perspective to every single issue? Because it came to my
yeah,
mind actually recently that, I
mm,
mean, just by noticing how people many times
yeah,
shift perspectives when
yeah,
dealing with different ethical problems. Oh, now you're being a consequentialist. There you're
right.
being a deontologist. Then
Yeah,
you're being
yeah,
whatever. Is that
yeah,
something
yeah, right.
in the? I mean, is that one of the ways how it would manifest?
Yeah. So, and I think this is it's a great question. And I think it's a really complex question. So
Yeah.
I think, for me, one of the lessons from this approach is kind of like a personal intellectual humility,
Mhm.
right? So when I'm making decisions, like I should be listening to others because I should know that my perspective is limited.
Yeah.
Other people might be tracking things that I'm not tracking. So, like, an example of this, I was like, we were like doing a workshop in my department, and there was sort of like a question. The question was like, you're a faculty member, and one of your graduate students that you're advising comes up to you on campus, and they like seem very flustered, and they ask like, "Can you meet with me this afternoon?" And then sort of the idea is like, and yeah, you sort of had already blocked off the time to do something that, like you could set it aside, but you kind of don't want to. What should you do? And I sort of said, well, like for me personally, like use some social intelligence. Like how flustered do they look? Does it look like a
Yeah.
genuine emergency or
Yeah.
not? And one of my colleagues, like great philosopher, good friend, she had an like entirely different approach. And she was like, well, would it be like is it a reasonable ask for everyone to do that, like to use their social intelligence? What would be reasonable for like any faculty member to do in this situation? And to me, I was like, oh, this is kind of like a Kantian virtue ethics sort of thing. um and so it was like philosophically interesting because we were asking sort of two different like ethical questions. So like one,
Mhm.
I was asking like, what would be the best thing for me to do given my personality and my abilities?
Mhm.
And she was asking then like what would be a reasonable expectation to have of others, like at a workplace like ours. And you know, at first I was like, well, my perspective is correct. But I thought like, no, that's also an important aspect of this question, right? So there's this sort of like intellectual humility point that by
Mhm.
having and listening to other perspectives, like there's more moral information that any of us are tracking in point. The
Yeah.
other side to this though is at the end of the day, we do need to make a decision. And if we're just sort of like get stuck listening to other perspectives, that doesn't help us very much. And I think it's incredibly important um, for us, like to develop our own personal moral approaches, to think about like what commitments do we want to develop in our lives to have our own moral projects. So while we should listen to others, I personally, I mean, and a person maybe could their life moral project might be like relativist. Maybe Zhuangzi, the ancient Chinese philosopher, was like this. But
Yeah.
for most of us, I think it's important to sort of develop our own approach. Like, what do we value? What are our deepest commitments
Mhm.
as a way of sort of making sense of the world and finding meaning in our moral lives? So it's a tension that I
Mhm.
don't think is like easily or at all resolvable, but I think it's a felt tension of human life.
Mhm. Yeah, and actually related to what I just commented a minute ago, I've noticed many times, I actually don't know if there's any scientific work done on
Mm.
this or not. I mean, if people in terms of their preferred ethical theory tend to be consistent or not. But
Yeah.
since
Um,
I mean, I work in science communication, basically,
yeah.
I move in science communication circles, and I don't know exactly why, but apparently there's many science communicators who are fond of utilitarianism. But then,
Yeah.
but then,
Yeah.
just to finish, but then I ask them just to tease them a little bit. Oh,
Yeah.
so if you're a pure utilitarian, why do you believe in human rights?
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And I think um and this is like I found utilitarianism so intuitive until
Yeah.
these sorts of questions came up,
Yeah.
and I still find it very intuitive
Yeah.
in so many areas. But and I think that's probably part of the story here is, like, oh, this gives us a nice answer
Mhm.
and a very compelling answer for a lot of kinds of cases, right? It seems to
Mhm.
be tracking exactly what we should be tracking in many cases. But then when you start asking these other questions, a lot of people's intuitions shift.
Mhm. And so, how does all of this link to your interest in Confucian ethics then?
Yeah.
And by the way, for the audience mainly,
Mhm.
what is Confucian ethics? What
Yeah.
characterizes it?
Yeah. So this is something that I didn't expect to be interested in. Before I started graduate school in philosophy, I lived in South Korea for 3 years. And when I
Mhm.
was there, especially among young people there, Confucianism was kind of not kind of negative word, it was a negative word, where they meant just sort of this old traditionalist way of thinking where you have to be respectful to your parents and old people, no matter how ridiculous or mean they are. And you have to be, and so it was like a really negative sort of um, idea about it. Then when I started my PhD program, I was sort of assigned to be a graduate teaching assistant to an introduction to Asian philosophy class. And I started to learn about, what do the original texts actually say? And I was really blown away by that. And that's in, large part to like wonderful teacher, Amy Olberding. But what's going on here? So this is um, some of the oldest, like robust ethical theory and debates that we have around 3,000 years ago in like what's today China. There was a highly successful, like highly academic, highly bureaucratic um, government, like in
Mhm.
a dynasty called the Zhou dynasty. And, they sort of have their problems, but for the most part, they have like a period of relative peace, relative prosperity. It's unlike sort of like ancient Greek philosophy, which develops in like small city states. It's over a huge swath of land. So
Mhm.
there's a huge bureaucracy. There's a large educational system. So like small, like public schools in villages, towns, and cities. And that training system sort of feeds into like government officials, and you need a lot of government officials. Um, the in part because you need lots of food for this, like large area, and you have these floodplains, and you need lots of big government projects to deal with all of the flooding. Like, so you have this. They start to sort of lose power, um, start to decline, and so around 500 BC, they've sort of lost all of their power, but people have been like kept records of these, golden ages. And you still sort of have this big bureaucracy, including like one group of people that are scholar officials. And these scholar officials have lots of different ideas about how to run government, how to live our lives. One of the most influential factions of these government officials, these scholar officials, were what we call in English the Confucians. In Chinese, they were called the Ru, and they sort of seemed to be originally kind of like the priest class. So they were in charge of religious rituals and ceremonies, um, kind of like courtly ceremonies, things like that. They were the ones who were experts and in charge of that. They were also, as part of their training, they also had to be experts in history, kind of like the history of public policy and things like that, and also like the history of literature, so like ancient poems. Um, around yeah, right around 500 BC, like around that era, um, we have Confucius, Kongzi, and Confucius is not the first like member of this group, but he seems to be able to articulate the underlying ethos of this group in a way that's sort of incredibly compelling and influential. And so he says that he doesn't invent anything, he just sort of transmits. So the idea is sort of that in the past there was a golden age, we figured it out, We figured out how to have a good, stable, prosperous society where people lived flourishing lives.
Mm-hmm.
We've lost track of that. But what did they do? What was so special about them? And so by Confucius's life, things were like going terribly. Civil war was on the horizon very clearly. And he wants to like stop this, like go back to what was working in the golden age. And so if you like say like, well, how do we stop this crisis? How do we get back to the golden age? You might say, well, what were the laws that they used? What were the policies that they used? What did they do that was so special? Confucius's kind of shocking answer was what was special about what they did were their rituals, sort of like their system of manners and etiquette. And that like it should be a very like the first time I heard it, like, that it's absolutely like etiquette, like come on, right? That doesn't matter all that much. Like it's nice, I guess, to be polite, right? But it doesn't matter all that much. And think about like in Western philosophy, some of our heroes, Socratic gadfly, like according to the I think the stereotypes are incorrect, but according to that stereotype, you know, he's far from polite. And maybe like socially oblivious. I think that's an incorrect understanding of Socrates, but that's like a pretty common view. So sort of the way that Confucius explains this, puts this all together, is something like this. It all starts and ends with good government. And by good government, he means something like non-corrupt and well-informed. So they sort of like make good decisions. So they have good information, and you know, can think about like they needed to take care of all this flooding and things like that. And you had to like keep an empire going over, you know, huge swaths of land. So if you don't have that, you know, good luck, right? Which to me seems, you know, like sensible enough. You are living in an area with a highly corrupt or a government that makes absolutely terrible choices. Like, yeah, good luck. You might be able to get by if you're like really clever or really lucky, but again, good luck. But then the question is, how do you get good government? Well, he says, we start with family. You need a good upbringing, right? You need families to raise their children well. How do you do that? Well, you need a good education system. Well, how do you do that? Well, the education system has to be tied back into the government. The education system has to train us to be like good, smart, non-corrupt government officials. Mm-hmm. So like we've got this cycle. How do you do all of this? And he says, what the successful dynasty of the past, what they did ingeniously was they invented a system of social etiquette, of social norms, rituals that at every step of the way helped do these things. Mm-hmm. And so and the idea is like he has stories about like every little ritual and how it helps us like be a better person in like little ways. Mm-hmm. Or make better decisions. So to give like one example that I found like really interesting, when you're a government official and you have like a tablet that has like a new law or policy, the ritual is you act as if that tablet is very, very heavy, much heavier than it actually is. So why do you do that? And this is to me where it gets really ingenious, because for the Confucians, they thought the ancient sages developed this based on a really, really good understanding of human psychology. Mm-hmm. So they thought in human psychology, heaviness is associated with seriousness. Right? So in English, we say like gravitas, right? Gravity, gravitas. So if you like act as if this policy is very heavy, it reminds you this is serious. This policy will affect people. Right? Yeah. And so the idea is they have all of these rituals in all arenas of life that sort of provide this like script that sort of directly helps us do something that's really good, but also trains us over time to associate different things together. Yeah. And so it ends up being this really, really robust, psychologically rich picture of moral development. And I found that absolutely fascinating.
So, but what is then exactly the connection between those aspects of Confucian ethics and what we talked about just a minute ago in terms of your perspective on ethics?
Yeah, absolutely. So the philosophy that was emerging at this time obviously is not the philosophy that emerged in like 20th century English speaking philosophy world, right? So there wasn't, you know, a clear, I mean, there wasn't always might not be a clear distinction between what we would call metaethics and normative ethics today, but there definitely wasn't back then. So, like, were the ancient Confucians moral realist or anti-realist or something like, I don't know. But there are little like things that they say every once in a while that to me suggest that it is something kind of like this constructivist picture, or at least very useful for contemporary philosophers. So I mentioned earlier, there's a couple hundred years, several hundred years after Confucius, a Confucian philosopher named Shunzi lived, and he like literally says the ancient sages invented ritual and rightness, and so his idea, and there's a lot of, he was also famous for saying that human nature is inherently bad or evil or something like that. He lost a lot of favor for some of his beliefs and some of his students and what they went on to do. But to me, it seemed like either they did believe or their approach was really useful for people who are trying to develop a constructivist view. Sort of, they thought that we have these different, like, numerous, like, moral intuitions, emotions, dispositions, and we're trying to make sense of them in the best way that we can. And now, what is the origin of those? So some of the Confucian philosophers said, like, there's heaven, right? This kind of like God-like-ish figure. And heaven gives us these dispositions or something like that. But at the same time, there's this element in Confucian ethics that is not always super interested in the supernatural aspects of their views. So Confucius would refuse to talk about, and so like students would ask him, like, how do I serve the ghost? And he says, like, we'll figure out how to serve the living first. One of the Confucian's earliest critics, the Moists, say the Confucians don't actually believe in any of this supernatural stuff. Shunzi, who I mentioned, actually comes out and says there's no such thing as like supernatural, like none of it actually exists. So there, even though many of them are and might be committed to sort of saying there is this sort of supernatural origin, what they're really interested in is, given all of these different emotions and dispositions that we have, how do we make sense of it? How do we construct a society and construct our own lives? And so people who are familiar with early Confucian ethics here might be thinking of one of the most philosophers in all the world, but especially East Asia, Mencius Mengzi, who thought specifically there like 4 like moral sprouts is like probably a good translation. Like a set of inclinations that we just naturally have. And to me, it's interesting because it's not just one. So it's not like the ethics of technology view, but like we have multiple dispositions, and we have to, like, what's the best way of making sense of fitting them all together? And to me, that's useful for constructivists. Whether the early Confucians actually could best be described as something along those lines or not.
That is actually very interesting, at least in 2 different ways. So one of them is that, at least in the Western philosophical tradition, I mean, perhaps there would be different readings of this, but at least my reading is that whether you fall more on the camp of deontology or consequentialism or virtue ethics or contractualism or something like that, there's a sort of moral realist assumption underlying all of those different ethical systems, right? But in that specific case, if you're reading of Confucianism, Confucian ethics is right, there's at least some anti-realist elements there. And then I mean, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that there's also some interesting anthropological work on, I can't remember exactly if this was done on Western societies or some more traditional societies, but at least there are societies out there where a majority of people tend toward a relativist perspective. That is, they think that the norms that operate in their society are objective and question it, but they also allow for other societies to have different norms, and they think that whatever norms they have are as objective for them as their own norms are for themselves. So I mean, just to say that we shouldn't assume neither
Mhm.
moral realism for
Yeah,
human nature or even for philosophy in
right.
general, nor
Yeah,
universalism. That is assuming
right.
that our own norms
Yeah,
or moral values, moral preferences
absolutely.
apply
Yeah.
to everyone out there.
A- Absolutely. And I think this is so important. This is one of the things that kind of really struck me as I was learning about classical Chinese philosophy, because there are often like many like shared assumptions or shared views, but there are also like little but very important differences. So
Yeah.
for, I mentioned earlier that the students who come into like intro to ethics and say human beings are fundamentally selfish. Um, that's actually not a common view in classical Chinese philosophy whatsoever. And in fact, the like one person who's most associated with that view, that sort of gets treated as radically, like a very radical view. The thought seems to be that we're sort of inherently more interested in those we care about. So like our family members, our friends, our neighbors, or stuff like that. And we're also like selfish sometimes, but we are like other interested in, and and so it often gets translated like partial. So we're like inherently partial, but that
Yeah.
doesn't mean we're like necessarily inherently selfish. And I was like, that actually seems to be more like descriptively accurate than
Yeah.
the sort of like radical egoism that we often um, find in American discussions,
Mhm.
especially.
So let's move on to another topic now. You also
Mhm.
do work on epistemic
Yeah.
injustice. So tell us, first of all, what
Mhm.
it is about.
Yeah. So this has been one of the hottest topics in philosophy in the past 15 or 20 years. And
Mhm.
I think incredibly important. So, first, like by epistemic, we mean things having to do with knowledge, having to do with learning, understanding, sharing,
Mhm.
like good information, getting good information, sharing good information, all of that sort of stuff. And there are forms of injustice or forms of oppression or marginalization that clearly have epistemic um, impacts. So, for example, if schools, like if you live in a racist society and schools in neighborhoods that are more densely populated by people in marginalized groups get less funding, students who goes to those schools like get less good like not as good of an education, they have fewer opportunities,
Mhm.
fewer like less support, they are epistemically worse off than they could have been because of oppression, right?
Mhm.
And so that's something that I think philosophers for a long time are like very aware of. Um, in 2007, a philosopher named Miranda Fricker published a book called Epistemic Injustice, and this became a like huge deal, a huge topic. And in that book, she argued that over and above that, there's a distinctive epistemic form of injustice or oppression. There's a way that injustice, oppression, marginalization affects people as knowers, as learners, as sharers of knowledge and information. And that's really, really, really interesting. And part of what makes it interesting might come through with some examples. So I'll just like mention quickly three examples. Two of these Miranda Fricker discussed in her work. These are testimonial injustice and hermeneutical injustice.
Mhm.
Testimonial injustice is kind of roughly when like the main case of testimonial injustice is when a person trusts you less, takes you as less credible because of your social identity, right? So your gender or your race or something like that. Um, and so we know that this is a feature of how oppression and marginalization works. So her examples of this, the in the original book, um, the most famous example is like To Kill a Mockingbird, right? So
Mhm.
people dismissing someone's testimony, like literal testimony in a court case, just because of their racial stereotypes.
Yeah.
And so this is something that, like, when, like, from my experience teaching about this, the students hear about, like, many students are like, I've experienced it. Now I have a word for this, right? So,
Mhm.
um, this happens in various different ways, and like very like complex ways that has like been explored in a lot of detail since the book came out. So that's testimonial injustice. Hermeneutical injustice, which, yeah, a big word, but for something that's a really, really fascinating idea, like having to do with how we interpret the world. And the rough idea is something like this. There are things that happen to us that we don't have words for yet. Sometimes that's just bad luck, right? So imagine before we had a word for depression, or had a word for anxiety, or a word for PTSD or something like that. We don't have a word for it yet. Now, like, we figure out this is a thing that happens. We've got a term for it. That's incredibly useful and helpful in various ways. It helps us as we like interpret the world, interpret our experiences better. Now, there's questions like, why don't we have a word for something? Well, a lot of times it's just sort of like, I don't know, bad luck. There's not really much of a story there. But there are some cases where we don't really have a good word, a good term for something because of oppression and marginalization. So Fricker's example of this was the term sexual harassment and sort of the story behind that, where and we actually like have a lot of detail about the development of this term, right? And sort of the relevant information here is that, like, sort of when it was being described in the group that like really got this, like the terminology up and going, what happened was everyone in the group was like, all the women in the group that were discussing this were like, yeah, that happened to me, but I never wanted to talk about, like, I blamed myself, or I was too embarrassed or ashamed to talk about this. And so because of social norms, like oppressive, prejudiced social norms, people didn't talk about it. And so it took a lot longer to develop this really important, powerful idea than it otherwise might have. Another example of this is like postpartum depression, right? If our sort of sexist expectations and norms are that, you know, like as a woman, you should be absolutely like, like so joyful to have a baby. Yeah. And like, this is, you know, like the big goal of your life, to be a good mother. Like, why are you down? And, you know, now we know, like, well, these really, really sexist, problematic, uninformed views make it difficult for some people to notice and track and explain what, like, something that happens.
Actually,
and the third,
yes, sorry for interrupting you, but actually just to add to that, because postpartum depression, of course, is associated with sexism, but there's also a broader social theme, let's say, that applies to both men and women, that I was just reading a few minutes before we started the interview, an article on Psychology Today about people who regret becoming parents, and that's something that we almost never hear about.
Good. Yeah, there's lots of interesting stuff about this where, it's my understanding is the research suggests that becoming a parent does not make you happier. Now you might find like more meaning in it, or like, you know, many people say they don't regret doing it, but it's stressful. Like you don't sleep for years. And yes, and this is like, I think something that, like, the first time I encountered it, like the very first feminist philosophy class that I took in graduate school, it took a lot of it to click, but now it's so obvious. We have such strong narratives about parenting and, you know, especially motherhood, but parenting in general, that just are incredibly dangerous. Like in some cases, just not true, but I think even if true, incredibly dangerous, because, you know, if the narrative is like, this is one of the most important, meaningful, and joyful experiences of life, if you aren't feeling joy in a particular moment, if you're feeling stressed, what do you, like, you can't deal with that. You can't understand it, right? And that's one of the reasons that this idea of hermeneutical injustice is so interesting and powerful. And the idea, like, it's an incredibly stressful, disorienting thing to experience something but not have words for it. And it's an incredibly empowering thing to get a word for it. Okay, the last thing that I wanted to mention about epistemic injustice in general, and this is work by like great philosophers like Gail Polhouse Jr. and Christy Dodson, who have said this idea of hermeneutical injustice, we don't have a word for some phenomena that is affecting people. That's something that, you know, happens, but something else that happens, maybe happens more often, is actually the oppressed group has words and has terminology and has been talking about this stuff for a long time. And people from the like oppressive groups from the dominant groups can't and won't listen to it.
Yeah.
And so you can't contribute to the conversations because
Mm-hmm.
people just won't believe you. And so, for example, if you sort of have an encounter at your workplace that strikes you as like kind of racist, and you bring it up, and someone replies and sort of dismisses you and say, "Well, you're just playing the race card."
Mm-hmm.
You can't really contribute to the conversations, even though you've been talking about it. And so, many philosophers have pointed out that the phenomena that people are talking about when they're talking about epistemic injustice that Fricker was talking about, actually people have been talking about for a very, very long time. Feminist philosophers have been talking about it. Black feminist philosophers have been talking about it for a long time. I think there are really, really, like, I think one of the best works on epistemic injustice is Frederick Douglass's speech, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July,"
Mm-hmm.
back in the 1850s, right?
Yeah.
So, and so the last thing I'll say about this is, yeah, just in the last 20 so years, 15, 20 years, there's just been an explosion of interest in these topics and people thinking through all of the different ways that this affects us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in the interest of time, I have one more question
Yeah.
that I would like to ask you, and perhaps later on in the year, if you agree, we can have another conversation to cover some of the other topics that I had prepared. But I mean, just before I get into the last question, I also wanted to comment that, I mean, this epistemic injustice thing, I mean, it's very interesting because while you were talking, for example, about postpartum depression and stuff like that, I was thinking that there are many ways in which people sort of naturalize their own societal norms, and sometimes they try to find in a sort of more natural way or in nature itself a justification for their norms. Like, for example, until a few decades ago, probably virtually no one used the term homosexual or gay, and then people started to understand that there was probably nothing wrong with them. They were just attracted to to people of the same sex. And so now we have this understanding of homosexuality and what a homosexual is. And the same thing applies to probably asexual people, because we just assume that everyone is sexually attracted to one or the other sex, or to anyone out there. And now we know that there's a minority of people who don't even, they are not interested in sex, they don't want to have sex, and all of that. And I guess that this is also important because I brought up the example of people who regret having kids, and and perhaps it would be interesting to know what would happen in society if this sort of societal coercion to make people have kids. Because I mean, sometimes people might say, "Oh, you're complaining about that, you're just a crybaby," but it's sexual coercion, because women more than men, I guess. You might get ostracized and all of that. People might look down on you if you're childless, particularly past a certain age. And it would be very interesting to know how many people would feel more at ease staying childless throughout their entire life if they were not exposed to this sort of social coercion. Right.
Absolutely. I think so the first thing is, these are fantastic examples, I think, of something like hermeneutical justice, right? Improvements. So I think this is, and I think a really, really unfortunate, toxic element of like American society, many other societies, is sort of being really dismissive and demeaning. Like, people make fun of young people now for saying like, oh, they have all of these different genders and they're like constantly changing their gender, things like that. It's so incredibly frustrating, because to me, like, what's going on is people are finally like better understanding their own experience and coming up with words for their own experience, and finding that there are plenty of others out there who like encounter these words like asexual and are like, oh my gosh, that describes me perfectly, or bisexual. Like, there's so many different better words, and this is like, it's actually been happening for much longer time, but now it's People are more and more aware of it because of internet and social media. And so to me, this is like a great triumph of hermeneutical injustice, of hermeneutical justice, sorry. Like having these terms that people personally like encounter that, oh my gosh, that's me. And yes, so I think that's a fantastic example of this sort of phenomenon, why it matters so much to people.
So my last question then, and I guess that probably to a certain extent this would also connect to epistemic injustice. So you've done work on the continuation for women in academic philosophy. So what could you tell us about that?
Yeah, this is something that this is actually like one of my first semesters in my PhD program was when I started doing this. And so, yeah, the background here is there are many academic fields that have diversity problems. That's no surprise for academics. Many fields that are the vast majority of faculty are white or white men. Philosophy historically had been one of the least diverse academic fields at the level of faculty, and especially tenured faculty. And people had been concerned about this for a while and talked about it for a while, but they hadn't necessarily done a ton of actual empirical research for it, which isn't that surprising given that we're philosophers. Like we sit in our armchair and try to figure out problems. And then, over the past, especially 10 years, people have started to look at this empirically, try to get some data about this. And like in general, people have been like the sciences have been doing this for a while and doing lots of good research, but people started to do this in philosophy. One of the common stories is we say something like a pipeline problem, right? So that fewer women take philosophy classes, then fewer women major in philosophy, and so fewer women study philosophy in graduate school, and then like when graduate school, people don't finish graduate school for various reasons, so they don't become fat, right? So there's that story. There was some research that, and so the initial research that we published was a group of scholars. I was definitely not the only person. Heather Demarest really led that team. And we were interested in some research suggesting that in philosophy, actually one of the biggest drop-offs occurred not in graduate school, which is what many academic philosophers would assume, but right after introduction to philosophy classes. And that was really interesting to us. Like, what is going on in intro to philosophy that is making philosophy very homogenous? So what we did was we gave out surveys at the beginning and end of every of a semester in as many different intro to philosophy type classes as we could. And what we found, and this is, it was just one study. We had, around, I don't remember exactly, 250, I want to say, people, which is, 1,000 would be better, but it was not nothing. And what we found two really interesting things. So, like, we asked many questions about their opinions and their feelings and their experiences with the philosophy classes. And some of them, maybe expected there to be a big role in predicting how, like, were they interested in taking future philosophy classes? It turned out that there were two questions we found that had a shockingly big impact on whether they reported that they wanted to take more philosophy classes. And the one that has has really, really been influential for me is this question. I feel similar to the kinds of people who become philosophers. That was incredibly, like, from a social science perspective, shockingly predictive of whether they said they would take future philosophy classes. At the beginning of the semester, there was no difference between like self-identified men and women students. At the end of the semester, there was. And, it was sort of like right on the border of like, are we absolutely certain that this is like, in fact, but so like we need more information, but it looked like that seems to play a big role. The other question was, I enjoy thinking about philosophical questions and puzzles. now I wish that we would have said, like, I enjoy thinking about philosophical issues or something like that. I wonder what the questions and puzzles bit, the way that we, phrased that was doing, because we didn't expect that one to actually do anything. That one had a gender difference at the beginning of the semester that widened over the course of the semester. But the thing that, it really struck me as, like, what kind of signals are we sending in our classes about who belongs in philosophy? And so I've come to think, why be surprised if your syllabus is all dead white men that your students are all live white men, like live white men? There's so many little signals that we send about who does philosophy, who doesn't do it. And part of that is like who's on the reading list, but they're also like much subtler things. So my go-to example of this is, well, two of them. One thing we frequently say, philosophy began in ancient Greece. That's a very common thing that people will say in introduction to philosophy classes. So, I mean, philosophy probably began about 5 minutes after the first verbal disagreement that human beings had, right? Like, what do you mean that I'm not a good hunter? I don't know. Like, what do you mean these berries aren't good enough?
I mean, and when it comes
Yeah,
even to let's even if we talk just about people who lived as philosophers,
yeah,
we
right,
have done some
right.
intellectual work
Yeah,
of that kind. I mean, even
mhm.
now we know that
Exactly.
that ancient Athenian and Greek
Yeah,
philosophers were probably influenced by the Persians, the Indians, and others,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. And it seems like the ancient Greeks thought that philosophy probably originated in ancient Egypt. Many of them like literally say that. And like relatedly, and again, the little signals we send in philosophy, if you specialize in the subfield, ancient Greek and Roman philosophy, we use shorthand. We say ancient. So when we say ancient in academic philosophy, at least in the US and the UK, that means ancient Greece. It really means kind of Plato and Aristotle. That it's like changing a little bit. It really means like ancient Greek. But philosophy existed in like that we have in ancient India and ancient China, ancient Egypt. Like we know it. So when we like send the subtle signals that we send about who does philosophy and why, I think end up having like, the subtle and then the not so subtle signals. Like again, is the syllabus like only dead white guys or people who, even though like the ancient Greeks were not Western Europeans in any way, shape, or form, but they get kind of whitewashed in some ways of talking and teaching about them.
Well,
So
maybe
yeah,
maybe in the university, the philosophy departments where people do not teach Chinese, Arabic,
yeah,
Indian, African
yeah.
philosophy, they should be called Western philosophy departments.
Yeah, I mean, like call a horse a horse.
Yeah. And so, were you about to say something else about this issue of women not
Yeah.
continuing in their
Yeah,
philosophy
yeah. So, and
degrees?
I think that there's so much research like that still needs to be done about that. It's a very complex problem, and this is like far from the only. Like, there are tons of well-known issues about sexism in academia and academic philosophy. So, it's a big problem with multiple causes. But I think one of the important issues that people should be aware of, like in their own teaching and presentation of philosophy, is the signals they send about who belongs, who does philosophy, the big signals, the direct signals, and the indirect signals that we send about who does philosophy. Because students pick up on that.
And so, in your mind, what would be some possible solutions for that?
Yeah.
If those are the causes, I mean, would we
Mhm.
need, for example, to talk more about women
Mhm.
philosophers in history, or even
Yeah.
contemporary women philosophers, or to
Yeah.
have more women
Mhm.
philosopher role models
Yeah.
in academia,
Yeah.
or
Yeah. And so this is like in that original paper um, that came out, an analysis all those years ago. One of the things we suggested, what we called them like counter stereotypical exemplars, right? So, like in your class, emphasizing people who don't fit that mold of like the stereotypes of an old white lonely hermit with a beard sort of thing. And there are many in fact, maybe more canonical philosophers than most don't fit that stereotype.
Yeah.
I think again, it's a multifaceted problem with multifaceted solutions. So departments should be hiring people that can teach non-Western philosophy. Philosophers, everyone's overextended and overworked, and we don't have enough time to learn about our own specialization. But I mean, in my own department here at Harvard, so many people have been like slowly including more and more non-Western philosophy in their classes, especially like intro classes, in ways that like they find very rewarding and interesting, and are is often less difficult than people expect to do, when they put off doing it. And yeah, so I think it's a multifaceted problem and it needs a multifaceted solution. But a big part of it is just doing and having people that can talk and teach about philosophy sort of outside, and also sort of like problematizing the canon. So like some of the philosophers here who specialize in early modern philosophy have done really, really cool work on people who maybe they were very important in their own, like Mary Shepard, Mary Estelle, but didn't get included in the canon for various reasons. Francois Poulain Delabarre is one who just blew my mind. And so there's so many different options that people have for teaching philosophy in a more welcoming way. And it's healthier. It presents philosophy as something that people everywhere, all over the world, have been concerned about. And students really respond to that and react to that much better than the story we used to tell that philosophy began in ancient Greece. And it's this one great conversation that like 8 white people had that we're going to learn about.
Yeah. No, I definitely think that people should listen to Peter Adamson's History of Philosophy without any gaps. It's fantastic.
Yeah, it's phenomenal, right?
Yeah. And so, Dr. Robertson, I'm getting really mindful of your time now, so probably it's better for us to wrap up the interview here. Just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you and your work on the internet?
Yeah, so I have a website that I haven't updated in a while, but SethRobertson.net. And then I try to update that with some of my current work and recent publications. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was really, really wonderful to talk about these topics with you.
No, thank you so much. It's been really fun to talk to you. Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you liked it, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, learning and development done differently. Check their website at enlights.com, and also please consider supporting the show on Patreon or PayPal. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Per Ergo Larsen, Jerry Mullerens, Frederick Sunda, Bernardo Seixas, Olaf Alex, Adam Kessel, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollis, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Philip Forrest Connolly, Dan Demetri, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Phil Kavanagh, Mikkel Stormir, Samuel André, Francis Fortiago Nunes, Fergal Cossen, Hal Herzog, Nuno Machado, Jonathan Labyrinth, João Linhares, Stantantia, Samuel Correia, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, João Eira, Tom Hummel, Sardas France, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Romain Roach, Diego Londonho Correia, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavlo Stasevski, Nelek Bak, Madison, Gary G. Alman, Sam Afzal, Adrian Yeager, Paul Tolentino, João Barbosa, Julian Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Douglas Fry, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Ponce Cortez, Ursula Litsky, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, Sonny Smith, John Wiseman, Daniel Friedman, William Buckner, Paul George Arnaud, Luke Loaki, Georgios Theophanos, Chris Williamson, Peter Wolozin, David Williams, Diogo Costa, Anton Erickson, Charles Murray, Alex Shaw, Maury Martinez, Coralie Chevalier, Bangalore Atheists, Larry Dealey Jr., Old Erringbone, Sterry, Michael Bailey, Dan Sperber, Robert Grassi, Igor N., Jeff McMahon, Jake Zool, Barnabas Radix, Mark Campbell, Thomas Dovner, Luke Nissen, Chris Story, Kimberly Johnson, Benjamin Galbert, Jessica Nowicki, Linda Brandon, Nicholas Carlson, Ismail Benzliman, George Coriatis, Valentin Steinman, Per Crowley, Kate Van Goller, Alexander Hubbard, Liam Dunaway, B.R. Masood Ali Mohammadi, Perpendicular, Jonas Hertner, Ursula Goodenough, Gregory Hastings, David Pinsoff, Sean Nelson, Mike Lavigne, and Dios Necht. A special thanks to my producers, Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Tom Vanagdam, Bernard Ugni, Curtis Dixon, Benedict Mueller, Thomas Trumbull, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, John Carlo Montenegro, Alnick Ortiz, and Nick Golden, and to my executive producers, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Quadriano, Bogdan Kanivets, and Rosie. Thank you for all.